The thermometer outside Elias Thornton's cabin read -52 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that had already killed 17 men across the Colorado Rockies during the blizzard of 1883. Inside his small log shelter, buried under 12 feet of snow for 6 straight weeks, Elias sat comfortably in shirt sleeves while his mysterious stove glowed with a steady heat that hadn't faltered once since the storm began. When rescuers finally dug through to his cabin in March, they found something that defied everything they knew about frontier survival. A fire that had burned continuously for 42 days without being tended, and the man who built it very much alive. Before we reveal how one mountain man achieved the impossible, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if stories of incredible survival fascinate you, that subscribe button helps us bring you more untold tales from America's frontier. The blizzard that struck the Colorado Rockies on January 15, 1883, began as a wall of white moving across the mountain peaks at 60 miles per hour. Weather historians would later classify it as the deadliest winter storm to hit the central Rocky Mountains in the 19th century. By the time it ended 6 weeks later, entire settlements had vanished beneath the snow, and the death toll across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana exceeded 200 souls. Mountain men who had survived decades in the wilderness froze to death in their cabins. Experienced trappers who knew every survival trick died when their fires went out and couldn't be restarted in the extreme cold. The storm didn't arrive with warning. The morning of January 15th had dawned clear and relatively mild for winter, with temperatures hovering around 10 degrees above zero. Trappers were checking their lines, hunters were tracking elk, and miners were working claims as if it were any other winter day. By noon, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees. By sunset, it was -30 and falling. The wind came next, driving snow horizontally with such force that it stripped bark from trees and carved channels in exposed rock faces. Marcus Wheeler, a trapper working the Cache la Poudre River drainage, made it back to his cabin just as visibility dropped to zero. He spent the next 3 days feeding his cast-iron stove constantly, burning through his entire winter wood supply, trying to keep the interior temperature above freezing. On the 4th day, with no wood left and the storm showing no signs of breaking, he attempted to reach a neighboring cabin 500 yards away. Searchers found his body in April, 30 feet from his door. Similar stories played out across the mountains. The Hutchinson brothers, experienced mountaineers who had trapped the Rockies for 15 years, died when their stovepipe clogged with ice and filled their cabin with smoke. They had to choose between suffocation and freezing. They chose the cold. James Morrison, a prospector wintering in a reinforced cabin near Breckenridge, survived 12 days before his fuel ran out. His journal, found with his body, documented the temperature inside his cabin, dropping 5 degrees every hour after his fire died. The storm's intensity overwhelmed every traditional survival method. Standard cast-iron stoves, the most advanced heating technology available to frontier inhabitants, couldn't maintain combustion in the extreme cold. The metal conducted cold as efficiently as heat, requiring constant feeding to maintain any warmth. When men slept, their fires died. When they ran low on split wood, they had to venture outside to their wood piles, a journey that proved fatal for many. The wind found every gap in cabin construction, driving snow through spaces that had seemed perfectly chinked in normal weather. It was against this backdrop of death and failure that the discovery of Elias Thornton's survival seemed impossible. On March 3, 1883, a rescue party working through the valleys north of Pikes Peak spotted what might have been a chimney pipe protruding through the snow. The rescue party spent 4 hours digging down to what they assumed would be another tomb. They had already discovered 11 frozen bodies in similar snow-buried cabins throughout the valley. When they finally broke through the roof and dropped into the cabin's interior, they found something that made no sense. The temperature inside was above 60 degrees. Elias Thornton sat at his table, thin but alive, reading a book by the light of a kerosene lamp. His stove glowed with a steady heat, and a pot of melted snow steamed gently on its surface. The rescuers stood in stunned silence, ice still clinging to their beards, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. "Gentlemen," Elias said, marking his place in the book, "I was wondering when someone might dig me out." The impossibility of the scene before them defied rational explanation. every other cabin they had found contained frozen corpses and dead stoves filled with cold ash. Yet here was a man who had survived 6 weeks of complete burial, maintaining heat in conditions that had killed seasoned mountain veterans. When they asked how his fire had kept burning, Elias gestured to the peculiar stove that dominated one corner of his small cabin. It looked nothing like any stove they had seen before. To understand how Elias Thornton achieved what others could not, the story must go back 5 winters to 1878. That December, Elias had been working trap lines in the high country with his partner, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Stenberg. They had built their winter camp at 9,000 feet elevation, higher than most trappers dared to winter, but close to prime beaver territory. Their cabin was solid, their wood supply ample, and their stove was the best cast iron model available from Denver. On December 29th, a sudden cold snap dropped temperatures to -40. Their stove, which had performed adequately in normal winter conditions, became a losing battle against the Arctic air. No matter how much wood they fed it, the cabin's temperature kept dropping. The cast iron radiated cold from its outer surfaces, even as fire burned within. Ice formed on the interior walls. Their water supply froze solid. Wilhelm began showing signs of hypothermia by evening, shivering uncontrollably despite sitting directly next to the stove. Elias spent that night feeding the fire constantly, but wood disappeared into the firebox at an alarming rate without producing sufficient heat. By dawn, their indoor thermometer read 12 degrees. Wilhelm had stopped shivering, a bad sign that his body was shutting down. Elias wrapped him in every blanket they had and prepared to make a desperate run to a lower elevation camp 7 miles away. But Wilhelm was already too far gone. He died at sunrise on December 30th, freezing to death inside a cabin with a burning stove. The experience shattered something in Elias Thornton. He had done everything right, followed every rule of winter survival, maintained their fire without break, yet still watched his partner freeze. The problem wasn't effort or knowledge, the problem was the technology itself. After burying Wilhelm on a windswept hillside, Elias spent the remainder of that winter observing fire with the intensity of a man possessed. He maintained detailed notes on burn rates, heat output, and fuel consumption. Where other trappers saw a simple necessity, Elias saw a system failing at fundamental levels. His cabin became a laboratory where he documented every aspect of combustion in extreme cold. The standard cast iron stove consumed 8 logs per hour in severe cold, yet barely maintained livable temperatures. The mathematics were merciless. A man needed 96 logs per 12-hour period just to avoid freezing. Sleep became impossible without risking death. The fire demanded constant attention, creating a cycle of exhaustion that had likely contributed to many cold weather fatalities. Elias timed how long different wood types burned, measured the heat at various distances from the stove, and recorded how quickly temperatures dropped when the fire diminished. Pine burned hot but fast. Aspen lasted longer but produced less heat. The dense oak he had hauled up from lower elevations performed best, but even it disappeared into the firebox at rates that made survival arithmetic brutal. In February 1879, Elias descended from his mountain camp to visit other trappers, ostensibly for supplies but really to study their heating methods. At Jack Morrison's cabin near Fairplay, he found the same pattern of failure. Morrison showed him scorch marks on his floor where he had moved his stove closer to his sleeping area, trying to maximize heat exposure. The proximity made the fire more dangerous without solving the core problem. Morrison admitted he hadn't slept more than 2 hours consecutively all winter, constantly waking to feed the flames. Thomas Ashford's setup 12 miles north revealed another failed adaptation. Ashford had installed 2 stoves in his small cabin, reasoning that redundancy would provide security. Instead, he had doubled his wood consumption without significantly increasing the ambient temperature. Both stoves demanded feeding, creating twice the work for marginal improvement. The cabin's interior still hovered near freezing during cold snaps, despite burning through Ashford's woodpile at an alarming rate. The most telling visit came at Ben Cooper's cabin in March. Cooper had died 2 weeks earlier, and Elias helped recover his body. Inside the cabin, they found evidence of a desperate final struggle against the cold. Cooper had burned his furniture, his trap frames, even portions of his log walls in a doomed attempt to keep his stove fed. His journal contained increasingly frantic entries about dwindling wood supplies and falling temperatures. The last entry, written in a shaking hand, simply read, "Fire dying." Studying these failures, Elias identified the core problem. Traditional stoves were designed for moderate climates where maintaining combustion was straightforward. They relied on radiant heat from iron surfaces, which became a liability in extreme cold. The constant feeding requirement meant survival depended on staying awake and active, an impossibility over extended periods. Most critically, the stoves had no mechanism for sustained, regulated burning. Fire was either blazing and consuming fuel rapidly, or dying and providing insufficient heat. There was no middle ground, no way to achieve steady, long-duration combustion. Elias Thornton arrived in Denver on April 20, 1879, carrying the accumulated pelts from his winter trapping and a list that would raise eyebrows at every hardware merchant in the city. While other mountain men spent their earnings on whiskey, women, and basic resupply, Elias had different priorities. His first stop was the Daniels and Fisher Mercantile, where he presented a list written in his precise hand. The clerk studied it with growing confusion. 20 pounds of copper coiling, specific gauge. 40 feet of double-walled steel pipe, cast iron plates of exact dimensions. Fire brick, but not the common type high-temperature ceramic brick imported from Ohio kilns. The shopping continued at specialized establishments most trappers never entered. At the Colorado Mining Supply Company, Elias purchased equipment typically used for assay furnaces, temperature-resistant gaskets, adjustable dampeners, and specialized metal joinings. He spent hours at Josiah McKenna's metalworks, commissioning custom pieces, a circular chamber with precise measurements, steel baffles cut to specific angles, and a peculiar spiral component that McKenna had never seen requested before. When McKenna asked about its purpose, Elias simply said it was for improved heat circulation. Word of Elias's unusual purchases spread through Denver's small community of mountain men. At Hoffman's Saloon, where trappers gathered to drink away their earnings, his shopping list became a source of amusement. "Thornton's lost his mind," Jake Caldwell declared, slapping the bar for emphasis. "Spending beaver money on fancy metalwork like he's building a locomotive." Others joined the mockery. Pete Williams joked that Elias was constructing a still, though no one could explain why he'd need fire brick for moonshine. Tom Bradley suggested he was building some sort of mining equipment, hoping to strike it rich in gold instead of fur. The most expensive purchase came from the Denver Cast Iron Works, a custom-forged firebox with double walls and precisely machined connection points. The piece alone cost more than most trappers earned in a season. The foundry workers had never created anything quite like it. Elias provided detailed drawings showing a chamber within a chamber, with channels running between them in a pattern that seemed unnecessarily complex. He insisted on watching the casting himself, checking measurements with calipers he had purchased specifically for this purpose. Beyond the metalwork, Elias bought items that seemed to have no connection to heating or trapping. A clock mechanism from a jeweler. Springs typically used in railroad equipment, glass viewing ports designed for industrial boilers, ceramic fiber insulation that had only recently become available from Eastern manufacturers. Each purchase was specific, measured, planned. He recorded every transaction in a leather journal, sketching how pieces would fit together in margins filled with calculations about airflow and heat retention. By the time Elias loaded his pack mules for the return journey to the mountains, he had spent nearly every dollar from his winter's work. Other trappers watched him secure the unusual cargo, shaking their heads at the waste. But Elias had a vision they couldn't see, a heating system that would burn continuously, regulate itself, and require minimal attention. Elias returned to his cabin on May 3, 1879, and immediately began transforming his living space into a workshop. He cleared out the old cast-iron stove that had failed to save Wilhelm, dragging it outside where it would rust as a reminder of inadequate technology. In its place, he laid a foundation of fire brick, mortared with heat-resistant clay he had mixed with sand from the creek bed. The foundation extended 3 feet square, larger than any normal stove base, creating a platform that would support something unprecedented in frontier heating. The construction began with the custom-forged double-walled firebox. Unlike traditional stoves where fire contacted iron directly, Elias's design created an air chamber between inner and outer walls. He drilled precise holes in the inner wall, angled upward to create specific flow patterns. The space between walls would trap heated air, creating an insulation layer that prevented the outer surface from radiating cold. He sealed joints with the high-temperature gaskets, ensuring no air leakage that could disrupt the carefully planned circulation. Above the firebox, Elias installed his most innovative feature, the spiral copper coil that wound through a secondary chamber. Cold air would enter at the bottom, travel through the heated coil, and emerge superheated at the top. The physics were borrowed from industrial heat exchangers, but the application was purely his invention. He soldered each joint meticulously, knowing that any failure in the coil would render the entire system useless. The copper gleamed in the lamplight as he worked, each turn calculated to maximize heat transfer. The feeding mechanism occupied weeks of the careful construction. Traditional stoves required opening the firebox door to add fuel, losing precious heat each time. Elias built a gravity-fed hopper above the combustion chamber, connected through an adjustable chute. Fuel loaded into the hopper would slide down as needed, controlled by a weighted gate that responded to the fire's consumption rate. The clock mechanism he had purchased in Denver regulated the gate's movement, ensuring consistent fuel delivery over extended periods. Airflow control proved equally complex. Standard stoves used simple dampers that were either open or closed. Elias installed a series of adjustable baffles connected by the railroad springs, creating a system that responded to temperature changes automatically. As the fire burned hotter, expanding metals would shift the baffles to reduce airflow. As temperatures dropped, the system would open to increase combustion. The glass viewing ports allowed monitoring of the fire without opening any doors, preserving the carefully maintained internal environment. By August, neighbors who had mocked his purchases began visiting to see the strange construction taking shape. The stove stood 5 feet tall, an imposing presence of black iron, copper, and steel that dominated the cabin's corner. Pipes and chambers created a sculptural quality that seemed more artistic than functional. Marcus Wheeler, stopping by on his way to set autumn trap lines, walked around it slowly. "Looks like something from a factory, not a cabin," he observed. Elias simply smiled and continued adjusting the mechanical components. The first test firing came on September 15, 1879. Elias loaded the hopper with a mixture of coal dust and hardwood chips, materials that would have smothered in a traditional stove. The mixture Elias poured into the hopper would have puzzled any traditional woodsman. Instead of split logs, he had created a careful blend of coal dust purchased in Denver, hardwood chips from his summer woodcutting, and compressed sawdust pellets he had formed using a hand press. The consistency resembled coarse gravel more than conventional fuel. Each component served a specific purpose: coal dust for sustained heat, wood chips for reliable ignition, sawdust pellets for consistent burn rate. He had spent weeks experimenting with ratios, documenting results in his journal with scientific precision. The hopper itself held enough fuel mixture for 48 hours of continuous burning, a capacity that seemed fantastical to anyone familiar with standard stoves. The chute connecting hopper to firebox featured an ingenious double-gate system. The primary gate, controlled by the clock mechanism, opened at regular intervals to release measured amounts of fuel. The secondary gate responded to temperature, using a bimetallic strip that curved with heat changes. If the fire burned too hot, the strip would bend, reducing the opening. If temperatures dropped, it would straighten, allowing more fuel to fall. Initial burns revealed the self-regulating airflow system's elegance. Primary combustion air entered through adjustable ports at the firebox base, controlled by the spring-loaded baffles. Secondary air, preheated by passing through channels in the double walls, entered above the fuel bed through carefully positioned jets. This staged combustion approach, borrowed from industrial furnace design but adapted for domestic use, created a rolling flame pattern that extracted maximum heat from minimal fuel. The smoke leaving his chimney was notably cleaner than typical wood stove exhaust, indicating more complete combustion. September 22nd marked the first 24-hour test. Elias loaded the hopper at sunset, adjusted the controls according to calculations in his notebook, and settled in to monitor performance. Through the night, he recorded temperatures hourly, checked fuel consumption rates, and observed the mechanical system's operation. The clock mechanism clicked softly every 30 minutes, releasing precise amounts of fuel. The temperature inside his cabin remained steady at 65 degrees, while the outside temperature dropped to 22 degrees. Most remarkably, he hadn't touched the stove once after initial lighting. Dawn brought validation of his efforts. The fire still burned steadily, the hoppers showed 3/4 capacity remaining, and the cabin maintained comfortable temperatures without intervention. But Elias wasn't satisfied with mere success. He spent the following weeks refining the system, adjusting spring tensions, modifying gate angles, and experimenting with fuel mixtures for different weather conditions. He discovered that adding crushed pine resin to the mixture created hotter burns for extreme cold, while increasing the sawdust ratio provided gentler heat for mild days. The true test came in November during an early winter storm. Temperatures plummeted to -15 degrees, conditions that would have demanded constant attention with a traditional stove. Elias's system adjusted automatically, increasing fuel flow and air supply to maintain interior warmth. He slept through the night undisturbed, waking to find the fire burning exactly as he had left it. The impossible had become routine, a fire that tended itself. The winter of 1882 arrived with unusual ferocity, bringing the first genuine trial of Elias's revolutionary heating system. December 2nd saw temperatures drop to -35 degrees, with winds that drove the effective temperature even lower. Across the Colorado Rockies, trappers huddled next to their stoves, burning through wood supplies at alarming rates. But in Elias Thornton's cabin, something unprecedented was happening. While others fought simply to survive, Elias maintained his normal routine, checking trap lines during daylight hours and returning to a consistently warm shelter. Word of his comfort during the cold snap traveled along the informal communication network that connected isolated mountain dwellers. Jake Caldwell, who had mocked Elias's purchases in Denver, arrived at the cabin on December 15th after hearing rumors of the self-feeding stove. He entered to find Elias working on trap repairs in shirt sleeves, the interior temperature a comfortable 68 degrees. Caldwell stood speechless, ice still melting from his beard, trying to reconcile the warmth with his own brutal experience maintaining fires through the previous weeks. "Show me how it works," Caldwell finally managed, his skepticism crumbling in the face of undeniable comfort. Elias demonstrated the system with quiet pride. He showed how the hopper's fuel mixture flowed at regulated intervals, how the mechanical gates responded to temperature changes, how the double-walled construction retained heat while the copper coil system distributed it evenly throughout the space. Caldwell watched the clock mechanism trigger a fuel release, saw the fire respond with increased intensity, then observed the automatic dampers adjust to maintain optimal combustion. The entire sequence occurred without human intervention, a mechanical ballet of cause and effect. More visitors followed as word spread. Thomas Ashford abandoned his failed two-stove system to study Elias's design. Ben Cooper's brother Eugene traveled 60 miles through difficult conditions specifically to see the stove that required no night tending. Each visitor arrived skeptical and left converted. They measured fuel consumption against heat output and found ratios that seemed impossible. Where their stoves consumed a cord of wood per week in severe cold, Elias's system used less than half that amount in fuel mixture while maintaining higher temperatures. The technical details fascinated those with mechanical inclination. The staged combustion created a blue-white flame that danced above the fuel bed, extracting energy typically lost up chimneys. The insulated firebox retained heat for hours even if fuel delivery stopped, providing a safety margin unknown in traditional designs. The viewing ports allowed flame monitoring without opening doors, preserving the carefully maintained combustion environment. Every element worked together in harmony, creating a system greater than its components. By January 1883, a dozen trappers had attempted to replicate Elias's design with varying success. Some managed crude approximations using salvaged materials, achieving longer burn times, if not true self-regulation. Others commissioned components from Denver foundries, trying to match Elias's specifications, but most lacked either the mechanical understanding or the patience for precise construction. They achieved improvement over traditional stoves, but not the revolutionary performance of the original. The approaching storm would soon demonstrate the life-or-death difference between adequate and exceptional. January 15, 1883, began with an ominous stillness that experienced mountain men recognized as nature holding its breath. By 10 in the morning, the barometric pressure had dropped so precipitously that Elias's ears popped inside his cabin. He looked through his window to see a wall of darkness advancing across the peaks, swallowing mountains in sequence like some mythological beast. He had perhaps 30 minutes to prepare. Moving with practiced efficiency, he topped off his hopper with fuel mixture, filled every water container from the creek, and secured extra supplies within easy reach. The storm struck with violence that defied description. Winds exceeding 80 miles per hour drove snow horizontally, creating instant whiteout conditions. The temperature plummeted 50 degrees in 2 hours. Elias's cabin shuddered under the assault, logs creaking as pressure differentials tried to tear the structure apart. Snow began accumulating at rates that seemed impossible, rising a foot per hour against the windward wall. Within 6 hours, drifts had covered his windows. Within 12 hours, only the chimney pipe remained visible above the snow. Inside, Elias's stove continued its mechanical rhythm, oblivious to the catastrophe outside. The clock mechanism clicked, fuel fell, flames danced, dampers adjusted. The temperature held steady at 65 degrees, while mere inches away, on the other side of the log walls, conditions that would freeze a man solid in minutes raged unchecked. The contrast was surreal. Elias sat at his table, recording observations in his journal by lamplight, while the deadliest storm in Rocky Mountain history buried his world. Days blended into weeks with no visual reference beyond the glass-covered ports of his stove. The hopper required refilling every 2 days, a simple task that took 5 minutes. His fuel supply, calculated for a normal winter, proved more than adequate for continuous burning. The mechanical systems functioned flawlessly, springs and gates and dampers maintaining their synchronized operation. While other mountain men fought desperate battles against freezing, exhausting themselves maintaining inadequate fires, Elias read books, maintained his equipment, and slept full nights without interruption. The psychological challenge proved greater than the physical. Complete burial created sensory deprivation that would have driven many to madness. Elias maintained sanity through routine, checking the stove's operation hourly, recording temperatures and fuel consumption, exercising within the confined space, preparing meals at regular times. His journal entries from this period reveal a man aware of the historic nature of his survival. Day 23. One entry reads, "Stove continues perfect operation. Estimate 8 feet of snow above roof based on chimney draft changes. Temperature inside remains comfortable. Fuel reserves approximately 60%. February passed into March with no break in the burial. Elias had no way of knowing that the storm had actually ended after 8 days, that the following weeks of entombment came from accumulated snow rather than continuing precipitation. He simply maintained his routine, trusting in the mechanical perfection of his heating system. The stove that others had mocked as over-engineered complexity had become his lifeline, burning continuously for 42 days without failure, maintaining warmth while winter claimed lives throughout the Rocky Mountains. The rescue party that broke through Elias's roof on March 3, 1883, included Marcus Wheeler, who had once dismissed the strange stove as unnecessary complexity. Wheeler later described the moment to a Denver newspaper. "We expected another corpse. Instead, we found Thornton alive and reading by lamplight, warm as summer inside, while we were half frozen from digging. That stove of his was still burning like he'd just lit it that morning, except he'd been buried 6 weeks. I've never seen anything like it before or since." News of Elias's survival spread faster than avalanche. The Denver Post ran a front-page story on March 12th with the headline, "The Fire That Would Not Die. Mountain Man Survives 6-Week Burial." Reporters struggled to explain the mechanical principles to readers, settling for phrases like self-feeding marvel and mechanical wonder. But in the mountains, where survival mattered more than journalism, trappers understood exactly what Elias had achieved. He had solved the fundamental problem that killed men every winter. Elias responded to the attention with characteristic practicality. Rather than capitalizing on fame or seeking patent protection, he opened his cabin to anyone wanting to study the design. Through spring and summer of 1883, a steady stream of visitors arrived. He provided detailed drawings, explained construction techniques, and shared his fuel mixture recipes. When asked why he didn't profit from his invention, Elias replied simply, "Wilhelm died because our stove wasn't good enough. If this design saves others, that's payment enough." By autumn, modified versions of the Thornton stove appeared throughout the Colorado Rockies. Blacksmiths in Denver, Fairplay, and Leadville began producing components based on Elias's specifications. The Denver Metal Works Company offered a complete kit for $75, including pre-cut double walls, mechanical gates, and clock mechanisms. While expensive compared to traditional stoves, the investment proved worthwhile. The winter of 1883 to 1884, though severe by normal standards, saw dramatically reduced casualties among trappers and miners who had installed the new systems. Documentation from the period reveals the design's impact. The Colorado Territorial Census of 1885 included a question about heating methods, showing over 300 households using self-feeding or mechanical stoves. Mining companies operating at high elevations began installing industrial versions in bunkhouses. The Consolidated Silver Company reported a 40% reduction in winter wood consumption after converting to Thornton design heating. More importantly, they reported 0 cold-related casualties among workers compared to losing 2 to 3 men annually in previous years. The design evolved as different craftsmen added improvements. Some replaced clock mechanisms with water-powered regulators that used freezing and thawing to control fuel flow. Others experimented with different fuel mixtures optimized for local materials. But the core principles, double-walled construction, staged combustion, automated feeding, and temperature-responsive controls remained constant. By 1890, what mountain men called Thornton stoves had become standard equipment for anyone serious about winter survival above 8,000 feet elevation. In 1997, a team of engineering students from the Colorado School of Mines discovered an intact Thornton stove in an abandoned cabin near Mosquito Pass. The structure had partially collapsed, exposing interior walls to decades of weather, yet the stove remained functional. When they dismantled it for study, they found mechanical principles that predated similar industrial applications by 30 years. The double-wall construction anticipated modern heat exchanger design. The staged combustion system matched patterns used in efficient furnaces developed during World War II. The automated feeding mechanism employed feedback control concepts that wouldn't be formally described until the early 20th century. Professor Margaret Chen, who led the analysis, published findings that challenged assumptions about frontier innovation. Elias Thornton, working alone with basic tools, created a heating system that matches or exceeds modern efficiency standards. His empirical approach to thermodynamics, developed through observation and experimentation, arrived at solutions that trained engineers would later discover in laboratory settings. This wasn't primitive technology refined. This was genuine innovation born from necessity. Elias himself lived quietly through the transformation his invention sparked. He left the mountains in 1889, using savings from his trapping years to purchase a small ranch in Wyoming's lowlands. He married Sarah Morrison, sister of the trapper who had died in the Great Blizzard in 1891. They raised 4 children who knew their father as a mild-mannered rancher, not as the man who revolutionized frontier heating. His journal, donated to the Denver Public Library after his death in 1912, reveals a man more interested in solving problems than claiming credit. The last entry, written 3 days before his death at age 71, reflects on his legacy. Sarah asked if I regret not patenting the stove design, seeing how widespread it became. But every winter, I think of men sleeping warm through the night instead of tending fires. I think of Wilhelm, who might have lived with better technology. That's worth more than any patent royalty. The fire keeps burning, passed from one builder to the next. That's enough. Modern estimates suggest Thornton-designed stoves saved between 200 and 300 lives during the frontier period from 1883 to 1900. The principles he developed influenced heating technology throughout the American West, from Alaska's gold rush cabins to Arizona's high-altitude mining camps. Historians of technology cite his work as exemplifying frontier innovation, practical, shareable, and born from immediate need rather than abstract theory. Today, historical preservationists maintain 3 original Thornton stoves in working condition. Each winter, they're fired for demonstrations, the mechanical gates still clicking in rhythm, the flames still dancing in patterns Elias calculated with pencil and paper. Visitors watch the automated systems function, marvel at the elegant engineering, and invariably ask the same question: how did one man, working alone, create something so advanced? The answer lies not in genius but in necessity, not in education but in observation, and not in complexity but in understanding fundamental principles. The impossible became possible because one mountain man refused to accept that staying warm meant staying awake, that survival required suffering, that the way things were was the way they must be.